Welcome to the audio series of lectures. We're going to cover grimoires in this particular lecture, and everyone loves grimoires. These fascinating old books which are images of or shaped from Hollywood movies of these old books and these big covers, usually large books that hold all the ancient secrets. Because, of course, the ancients knew everything. Well, there certainly are interesting resource material. And the Guild has always sought these out, and especially when you're new into occultism, people are just fascinated by this. This seems not to be any kind of modern silliness. It's somehow a pure, powerful system that the ancients knew, and that was passed on in some particular way or another. And because of this, it is assumed, of course, that they have great power. And grimoires need to be defined in several different areas. They certainly are fun reading. It certainly is interesting to look at the different grimoires. And we've went through most of the main grimoires, found the original French sources for them, or at least the best French translations of original grimoires, who tend to have changed the least and have always kept this kind of literature. Napoleon was a big fan of secret knowledge and basically sought the entire world for secret knowledge, and was a major part of what he was doing was not just trying to conquer the world, but he was trying to locate this esoteric secret knowledge. And like any ancient study, it's very, very difficult. I don't know, people just don't quite understand, particularly if you're young, the kind of chain of command, you could call it, the actual flow of who wrote the book, where it came from, where was it held, whoever held it, or offered it, what they did with it, changed it, not changed it, how they interpreted the information. It's extremely difficult. This also goes into the art of occult translation, which there's another lecture on, and how complicated it is to actually get proper translations. So when these books are brought to the public, God knows who translated them and what their actual meanings were. Because there's many, many layers to grimoires, which are the encoding in them. There's a whole bunch of secrets in grimoires that pretty much no one knows about except for extremely high initiates. We've recently released a simple system coded within the grimoires, but there's even actually much, much more than that. But the symbols, the drawings, all these types of secrets that are in grimoires are multifold and complicated and overlooked because those translating these books generally don't have a clue of what's really going on. But in general, where does this information come from? Where did it, some people claim things are complete fakes. Other books have been known to be complete creations, like the Necronomicon. The only problem with the Necronomicon is that it works, and people that use it are very happy with it. So when it comes to the fact of what works in the occult, it's what works for you, and that's the only system that counts. There's very little. When you're talking about going back thousands of years, and people need to understand a time frame, which is really critical. Christianity, which they started their calendar over. The calendar we use now is started over at the birth of Christ, supposedly. Christianity is 2,000, a little bit over, years old. Judaism goes back approximately 4,000 years. Some claim further, but The Jews like to claim they go back and back and back, but it really can be traced back to about 4,000 years. And Islam only goes back 1,500 years. So it was created 500 years, which is a long time after Christianity. In human years, 500 years is a long time. So, but what you're talking about is you got to understand the structures. You know, everybody who's living today thinks that the ancient world, I mean, you kind of think this subconsciously. Maybe if you sat down there and talked about it or gave it a more thought and a deeper discussion, you'd understand the differences. But very few people study history and understand the goings on. And in human evolution, modern evolution, or progression of civilization, I mean, things were nothing at all like they were today. And while there were great societies of the past that disappeared, like Atlantis and Mu, etc., these societies, very little is known of. And these information, at least the sacred esoteric information, which people valued back then, today they would save God knows what, Scientology, comic books, who knows. But back then there was a priesthood who saved everything and put these in special places and passed it on. There seems to be very little of this going on at the present. And if anything ever goes down or there's some sort of major problem with this new computerized world, things could be lost and lost forever. Things are being lost now at huge terabytes of information every minute with computers. Things aren't being converted over because there's new formats. I mean, we started off with all these different things like primitive recording devices went into records, went into vinyl records, went into cassette tapes, which notoriously were bad. They wore out, they squeaked, and that stuff was lost before it was even manufactured because you never could keep a cassette very long in the original music. And if you played it a lot, it was basically bad after a period of time. Records, of course, vinyl tend to survive physically, even though they're very fragile in terms of getting scratches and other things from use. Well, of course, these are coming back a little bit now, and a lot of young people or people under 40 will not know any of this stuff to a large degree. CDs, of course, nobody really knows how long they will last and what condition they will be in. They're relatively fragile as well in terms of getting scrapes on them, but they're small and easily protected in cases, so they can last. And of course, plastic lasts for millions of years, but we don't really know. One of the problems is not just the physical recording, what's been recorded on. It's the technology to extract that recording. But we've moved from CDs into now a whole bunch of memory chips, which are more fragile than anything else. Of course, people like them because they're small and can carry with you. That also means that you are going to easily lose them. And losing data in a computer system is extremely easy considering the mass amounts of viruses and just the faultiness of computers in general that tend to crash real easy. And as such, whatever data there can be easily lost if it's not backed up. And I don't know how many people back up properly. It's always a pain in the neck to back up particularly if you're working on things. So I tend to think people don't back up very well. They don't have a lot backed up, and that's a big mistake. People need to have memory chips that they use frequently, and they need to burn things onto disks and everything else. But you need to have backups, and you should have a fair amount of these. Most of that technology is pretty cheap now, so you can have numerous backups that don't cost you much. But as I mentioned, the problem is that while records have made a comeback as of late, there were times when it was very difficult to get something that play records. Um, the CDs, of course, will eventually go out of style, and will there be laser reading devices to actually be able to read CDs 100 years from now? How many people can play a VHH videotape now? Which is, went to DVDs. There must have been massive amounts of stuff on VHS videotapes that was lost. Must be massive. Who converted all that stuff over? So this is a real major problem just in modern times. And as we go through things, and if there ever is a major upheaval of society, pretty much everything will be lost. There'll be very little remembered, as all these fragile computer systems and memory banks that are kept in certain places around the world will be destroyed. And as the technology, which they want to keep changing on you to move you into different technologies so you keep spending money, will make previously recorded stuff obsolete. I mean, it's interesting that everybody talked about high definition TV, and now there's already several types of new TVs coming out that have made high definition TV supposedly obsolete. Of course, there's 3D TVs, and of course, the latest thing coming out in a couple of years would be holographic TV, which actually is certainly an interesting, exciting field where they actually have holographic images that'll be projected somehow. So they're going to keep moving into these technologies. You're going to keep getting rid of one. We went from DVDs to the Blu-ray. So it's a real problem with this keeping of information. And basically the only things that have survived, or at least the majority of things that have survived today, luckily, have been things carved in stone. And I don't know if the ancients planned it that way or not. Apparently they did to some degree, because they did write things down on different formats, from papyrus to others. Of course, the metal sheets that were written on have survived as well, the copper sheets and so forth. But most papers, and particularly modern paper, which is basically acid-based, it just dissolves over time. So it won't be there in a few hundred years, 99% of what's printed. These are the same type of problems the ancients ran into, and so much has been lost, it is staggering. Even in the last few hundred years, if you actually look into what's happened to a lot of ancient manuscripts, there are millions of them sitting around that have never been translated and continue not to be. Underneath this lecture, there'll be a link to a new little television documentary that talks about this, called The Bible Hunters. And you say, what does that have to do with the grimoires? Well, it talks about the search for ancient literature, and whether it's a Bible, you could substitute that for grimoires. You'll see how this kind of information was kept, even when there's a huge organized religion that believes in this. There's this fractured information. There are these ancient monasteries that have these endless amounts of texts that have never been translated in ancient dead languages. Over time and over the years, things catch on fire. They even burnt manuscripts, as mentioned in this particular documentary, because the monastery was so poor and had so much money and they were freezing, they actually burnt old books. Wow. Not to mention those who've come along and destroyed everything. Islam is famous for going through and destroying the Buddhist monasteries and taking their books and burning them. Islam in Afghanistan blew up a 5,000 or plus large Buddha. These are the type of things, of course, that are done all the time. And of course, the Christians who burnt all the Aztec and Mayan, which had numerous carved books and so forth, these are all destroyed. And every religion, even one pagan religion that takes over from another, burns the previous religion's information. So much has been lost, and so much is left untranslated, and a lot of it people don't even know what it means. There are stacks and stacks of languages that we have no idea how to translate whatsoever, and we wouldn't even know how to translate the basic Egyptian if the Rosetta Stone wasn't found. The Rosetta Stone, I don't know how many people have probably heard that term, but it was a stone that basically translated ancient Egypt into Greek and Latin on the stone itself, showed what it meant. And that's, until that was found, nobody really knew what any of the Egyptian stuff meant. So when we get into grimoires of questionable origin, so you're not getting things that are too old. Some Jewish-based texts, which is where most grimoires come from, the Christian tradition is a Middle Eastern tradition. Islam, Judaism, Christianity all comes from the Middle East, obviously. And of course, the ancient Jewish texts may go back. I doubt if they go back to the beginning, but they may be over 2,000 years old, maybe 3,000 years old. We don't know. They tend to go back to certain and are given credit as being written or coming from certain leaders like King Solomon, Noah, etc. Generally, these are written down by the priesthood, and of course, as the Jews moved around, they picked up bits and pieces from all the cultures they were in and added that into their own. Many of their techniques and so forth come from, or I should say, many of their rituals come from Egypt. Circumcision, which the Jews are famous for, was originally done by the Egyptians. Just like almost everything comes from the Egyptians. They made the first bread, they made the first beer, and on and on. And those that came in contact with the Egyptian cultures, like the Jews, picked up a lot of this stuff, including lots of their practices, magic, and even their gods and etc. And a lot of their stories may have been based on actually Egyptians other than Jewish people. Hebrew means desert wanderer. So when we get into all these things and we look at grimoires and they go back to the Middle Ages or medieval times where most of the ones come from now. And that's when they were originally started to be written, but not originally coming. They actually go way back before that. But this is when they started to becoming active there, and they were written down by monks and stuff. The only people who were literate were the people who were in an organized religion, who were actually taught by the church and supported by the church. So you have that whole prejudice in there as well. So someone who writes this down and who is who's putting this book together or translating this book is going to be under a lot of pressure from where they actually are involved in, meaning the Christian church, and there was only one church at that time. They're not going to be able to write down too many other things. That's why classic grimoires, which pretty much are the foundation for most ritual magic practices, evocation, like the Red Dragon Grimoire, the Art of Commanding Spirits, the Black Dragon, and the Grimoire Virum, and Legamenton. And, you go back to all these classic books are heavily influenced by the ruling religion of that time, and these were serious matters, and if you got excommunicated or thought to be dealing with the devil, you could be tortured and murdered, and this was a real consequence. But they still are based in this Judeo-Christian belief system. They are not talking about ancient magic. Now, people can argue that some of these entities may go back and symbolize older entities. Well, it doesn't matter because they're brought into the new format. So when you're doing medieval magic, like the Red Dragon Grimoire, you are doing it in a Christian understanding. And the entities that you're controlling, Lucifer and the fallen angels, are just that. They're Christian-based entities that are controlled by the ultimate power in Christianity, which is God and Jesus. And when you call upon these spirits, you control them in the name of God and Jesus, and all that is good. So that's certainly to be understandable, but these systems are based in that. So you've got to understand that when you're doing that, that this is not some pagan system that you're going to be using here. Now there are, I don't know if you can call them grimoires. There are a few grimoires coming from Egypt and Egypt's system of Egyptian magic. All of these have been pieced together. There are some Sumerian stuff which predates Christianity by several thousand years. But that's not the system you're using, and most of them will be involved in that. If you use Jewish magic, you're going to be using Yahweh to protect and help you, or Jewish God forms, etc. But it's going to be based in that. So again, it isn't some sort of pagan system when you're talking about your average grimoire. So they're all kind of based in that. There are a few that are pre that. But in general, when people talk about grimoires, they're talking about these medieval texts, which there's really only a handful of these classic texts out there. And there's many versions of these classic texts. But they're basically the same text. And there are other books which are older, which are the Jewish text, and there are some Arabic texts that are older as well. And at that time, the Arabs, or the Islam, was very literate and had built some basically advanced societies, getting most of their information from Egypt and from the Greeks who occupied Egypt for close to 600 years. And they were able to build these elaborate mosques from Greek instruction and Greek understanding, as well as getting the mathematic that they use. All came from Greece, who got most of their stuff from the Greeks, who got most of their stuff from the Egyptians, who got their stuff from Atlantis, who was thus itself influenced by extraterrestrials. I mean, that's the flow of information, basically, of how it works. But this wasn't invented by Islam. They got it from the Greeks. And the Greeks were great students and made sure, when they occupied Egypt for those hundreds of years, make sure they got every drop of information they could out of them and used it very wisely, and came up with their own variations of that where they improved upon it, like everyone does. But all Western philosophy, which is based on the Greeks, originally came from the Egyptians. And this is pretty easy to trace. Some people think that even the Jewish or Hebrew is actually part of the Greek, comes from Greece, from the Greeks. And there's been books written on this which are very interesting and compelling, that may have actually even come from there. But that's where the wells of information ended up. It's been transferred around the world to a certain extent, but that's the chain of information flow. But you're also talking about one translation after another, from the Egyptian to the Greek to the Latin to modern English. All this stuff starts to get into very huge problems of understanding. And of course, these are expressed in grimoires. And then there's the crass word-for-word grimoire, where you're actually just looking at the words. Then there's all that hidden coded things I've mentioned about. But grimoires are, because of this information being changed so much, and there isn't all that much really that's public. Believe me, there's an awful lot that isn't. But what's public with these typical grimoires, the Grand Grimoire, the Red Dragon, the Virum, etc., and some people have compiled all these copies. There's copies in Italian, there's copies in French, there's many different versions of these where there's more or less, and it gets all very confusing when you start looking for the perfect translation, if there is such a thing. Because the confusion between what the Greek words meant compared to what's transferred into Latin and only into English is quite quite shocking and quite confusing. Um, and the mistranslations are just, oh my God, endless. Then, of course, you have modern bumbling idiots that come along and add their own stuff there and mess things up. But as I'll save that for the translation lecture, which is very fascinating for those who really want to get into what's going on. But it's important to understand all of this. When things go back hundreds of years, things change dramatically. The actual, the way things were done then and done now is quite different. This even changes over 40 and 50 years as societies want to forget what they did bad and to justify what they're doing now, and people have very short memories. And this means that when things are then done in modern times, they're modified to make things look better. And if you have a particular viewpoint, or a belief system, a religion, you're going to translate something and you're going to warp it into your belief system. If you're a Satanist and you do it, and I've seen this in recent grimoire so-called translations, they warp it into their own belief systems. If you have a particular sexual leaning, you're going to add that into it. I mean, Aleister Crowley was known for doing this because he was his favorite homosexual practices. He made sure he added that into everything he did. So this is a reality that you have to look at. But when you get these ancient documents, you have to be very careful of what they actually say and do and where you've gotten the information from. And this is a real problem. If you're not getting it from a legitimate occult organization that is a teaching and research society like the Guild, which is the only one really there is that's public, then you're getting information from a very biased, prejudiced, and most likely business-based organization that's there to sell texts and to make it as outrageous as possible. They're not really interested in truth. They're interested in pushing their own agenda. And that's really sad. And so what they do is they modify these texts deliberately, a little here, a little there, and making them totally ineffective and even dangerous. So to use a grimoire properly, unless it's really been well translated and presented, and the Red Dragon, the Art of Commanding Spirits, and the Black Dragon were done at an extremely high level by a high professional occultist, and it's laid out in a fashion where you can really use it easily and safely. Some of the other grimoires we have were not as well, or were not done in a fashion to use them as easily. And at the time they were done, when the Guild released a lot of this stuff, it was released first to the membership. And we deliberately left the grimoires semi-open in terms of we gave you the crude, basic translation. And this was not done with the Red Dragon and Black Dragon, which we spent a lot of time on and brought it up to a very high level. But it was meant for the membership to go through it and to point out and to do further translations. It was meant to get a group of people together that were interested in this, and for them to figure out certain terminologies and ways of using these texts after the basic information was given to them. So you got to understand the vein it particularly came out in as of that time. A lot of information was grabbed, these different grimoires that came out in limited editions that were thrown around, and we grabbed up and did our own editions of them because they would be lost if we didn't do that. And it was meant to save these texts at reasonable prices for people, and also to be study guides. I mean, people are supposed to go out and actually do that, which they did not. That's what happens when you have too much of an easygoing organization. But when this was then released to the public, which we expected similar assistance in looking into it and saying, well, what else does anybody else see? So none of this really happened. People love to read grimoires just like they're pulp fiction. And unfortunately, a lot of grimoires are pulp fiction. A lot of it unfortunately, is too esoteric for the average reader to use and understand the deeper meanings and the encodings in it. Now, we intend on coming out with advanced editions of all these older books sometime. There's an awful lot that's being done, and an awful lot depends on should we really go into further details on some of these things. When there's more to be done in other areas, but time will tell. So with all this, being understood about grimoires, if you use one that isn't translated really well, you have to be an intermediate magician to actually be able to use these texts. A lot of beginning kids want to grab this stuff thinking they have the jewels of all time, the keys of the kingdom, and they don't understand that it takes quite a bit of understanding to use them. And also, if you are a skilled ritual magician, you know how to manifest, protect, and banish. So you don't have to necessarily slavishly follow some of the very arcane practices, making things out of iron, wearing leopard's belts, or these kind of things that were stated in ancient grimoires, which are really not needed if you know how to draw in the energy. People like to follow some of these things to the letter, but the big question there is, what did these do for the rituals? They say, well, they wouldn't have wrote that if it wasn't important, but we don't really know. Well, we don't really know that either. A lot of these things seem to be psychological. If you're wearing a tiger skin belt, you are somehow psychologically thinking you have power of the tiger around your power center of the middle of your body. It probably has absolutely nothing to do with contacting the spirit, but it's a psychological tool. But you certainly don't want to get involved in getting products from endangered species and illegal products at that, especially if they don't have any particular value, and they don't really seem to be. So these are all the questions that nobody seems to answer. Grimoires are published out there, and people like to put their own versions of these things out, which are basically rehashing the same old stuff, coming up with pretty much nothing new. They really don't talk about, is this an important factor? What can be modified, and what's the essential, important core ingredient of this grimoire that actually makes it work? That's critical, but nobody really talks about that. They want to talk about and get into all these details that to a large extent, who knows if that was just put in there as to make things sound important, because these books, again, were sold. These books were valued. So like anything, they're going to be, they want to make them exciting. They're going to put things in there that make them seem more exciting. Prime example, of course, is the Red Dragon Grimoire itself, subtitled The Art of Commanding Spirits. Now, it's interesting because the Red Dragon title means absolutely nothing. There is no Red Dragon ritual in the book. But people don't even know that basic encoding. The dragon was a symbol for the devil or evil or Satan. The actual red dragon illustration that's in that book is an encoded illustration. Basically, the dragon there is not your classic medieval type slaying the dragon and the knight. It's pictured pretty much as Satan. But there's a key to it. Now, the key to it is that on the dragon's wings are stars. The stars represent God's control over the demon. So it's not a demonic symbol, it's a control symbol. And generally, it's holding a shield. Now, what's in that shield, the way that the guild uses it, which is our symbol, means that the dragon is controlled by whoever it is holding their shield of. So the dragon is not only under divine power, but also under the earth power of whomever's image or logo, you could say, is on that shield. And few people know that. But again, by using that terminology, and because the book itself deals with the control of and use of Lucifer and the fallen angels, it had a great draw. You know, again, the dark magic sexiness that everybody likes of today was no different hundreds of years ago. So that's what the actual dragon figure in the red dragon represents and what it really is. And the terminology used was not the fact to mean that there's some red dragon you're calling on. But yes, technically it is, because the red dragon means Lucifer or Satan, which the book tells you how to control, but not sell your soul to like in a stupid pact of Faust, but under the control of God. And he does what you tell him to do, and you are taught how to make and how to make Lucifer and the demons do what you want. I won't get into that because that's under, you can listen to that under evocations and also under the Red Dragon description in general. But it's the original evocational text, and it's one of the few grimoires that really gives you the authentic, original way of evoking spirits and using, quote, fallen angels or demons, which is very popular today and everybody's interested in. But it shows you the correct way to do it step by step, and it's extremely clear that most magicians can understand easily, even with little skill. But it's still, it still pushes on intermediate level, because if you're going to do ritual magic in general, you need to know how to banish, how to protect, and all those things that is necessary when you're dealing with potent spirits. But knowing how to harness them and controlling them is the key, not being controlled or fearful of them, not making a pact where you give them your soul. What nonsense. Nobody did that. That's a fantasy story. So the idea is that these are critical understandings that you need when you're using a grimoire. And if you just get grimoires from anybody who claims that they are doing that, that they have some knowledge, and the people that are doing this don't seem to have any knowledge at all. I haven't seen any of them. They all seem to be based in Black Lodge Satanists. And they don't seem to have any background whatsoever in what they're doing. They just went ahead and basically got our editions and then played with them and added their own junk into it. Or people have compiled multi-versions of it, and then other people have translated it, and then they make their comments on it. It's a real mishmash of nonsense done by a bunch of unprofessional people. Plain and simple. It is not complicated to figure out what they're doing. But you should look into whom is doing this. What is that person connected to? Who are they connected with? What's the name of their publishing company? It's interesting that most publishing companies use these, or grimoire people that are out there are using satanic names. Isn't that interesting? Or even companies that have their 800 number that ends with 666. What is that all about? You have to be really careful, and this is very typical of the Black Lodge Illuminati that likes to play these little games of actually telling you who they are, and you don't want to believe it, and even when they give you information like that, people take it almost as a joke. But if this is important in your life, and you're trying to access power, and you're trying to use something that may be potentially dangerous, And lots of grimoires are. And if they're translated improperly and you use them, it can be highly dangerous. You need to keep that in mind. You can get possessed by it. You can bring in spirits you can't get rid of. They're trying to tie you into demonic energies. So these, grimoires have all these aspects to them, which also is the reason why people like them and they're kind of sexy, is because they're kind of dangerous. They go back to a time we see sword and sorcery pops up, and everybody feels like they're the great wizard or Conan himself going out and challenging the world. So everyone's attracted to these, but you have to really be careful if you're doing this in a serious manner. And you need to have some sort of foundation in general. But grimoires are so diluted and so changed. I mean, there's six different versions. You find a book and then you find this has been taken out, this has been added. And you got to remember, these are over hundreds of years through a system of libraries and institutions that things have been changed, books have been lost. Scribes have made mistakes. Scribes have changed things deliberately to fit into the social climate at that time, the political climate at that time. So you have all these factors to take involved of what this is. So that's another reason why you need to get a very advanced and skilled translation of any grimoire. And of course, everything is not in English. There's nothing in English of ancient grimoires, period, generally. Maybe something that came out of medieval England, but you're still talking about a language that really is not modern English. Most English, even in the Middle Ages, was closest thing to it that it was is actually Dutch. This evolved into Old English and then evolved into modern English that we have now. So it's all very confusing there, and you need to know that. In a lot of ways, it's best to take the key ingredients out of a grimoire, use it in a well-known core system, a good ritual magic system, or a good system like we present, the basic witchcraft sorcery core, add in these practices and use them as stated in these grimoires. That's another way of doing it. But there's interesting information there, and there isn't much elsewhere, and it's not as sexy as something coming out of a grimoire. If somebody does a modern sigil or something, people will not give it, oh yeah, that guy made that up. If it comes from 500, 1,000 years ago, whoever made that up then apparently had great power. And that's basically what happened. A lot of people think this comes from one particular source, just like all the religious material and everything else in the Bible. These have all been added to, changed 1,000 times, and there are different versions of it. It's just the more you do research, you find how diluted and changed. There isn't one particular way of doing things. And there are general ways that are just as effective. And there's all sorts of new techniques that nobody's talking about that can be used now because of the unprofessional and uneducated nature of everybody producing information today. But there isn't that many Western grimoires out. There seem to be a fair amount of grimoires still left to be translated from Arabic. There were several writers of magical texts from Arabic or Middle Eastern countries, from Persia and so forth. The problem with these is, you're still talking about 1,500 years back. Islam became into effect, and ever since then there's been this strong anti-witchcraft and magic philosophy that they would kill you just like the radical fundamental Christians and the Inquisition, etc. Every one of these religions, which all come from the same area, have the same basic fundamental beliefs when you get down to it. And those also means the same fundamental to kill all the infidels, which includes the Christians, includes the Jews, and certainly includes Islam. So how good that information is, and it's starting to come out with these different texts on jinns and other things, which are basically just another name for spirits, and how much better this is than any other text are really hard to say. But they had the heavy influence of Islam throughout the production of these. And there are many of these texts, from what I understand. There's an awful lot of from that particular tradition because they were very literate at that time. And there is 5 or 6 authors that have written about these things, but it's just barely coming out now. I mean, there was one guy who did the Secret Lore of Magic, Shaw, who was, I'm not sure what country he was from, but I think he was Iranian. And he translated books in the 70s, Arabic versions or of different grimoires, and talked about several writers, etc. And he translated some things, but people are still looking back at his work, which is 30, 40 years old, to get some information. And there's been a new company now, I think it's Ishtar Publishing, who is now translating some of these texts. And apparently they claim there's a lot of them. And of course it's very difficult, time-consuming work. And apparently they don't have much help. And of course that's a hard religion hard language to find people that know of. While finding someone who speaks French, German, or Italian is pretty easy to find and locate, and those texts are easier to handle, but there's a very limited amount of these, and every country seems to have different degrees of changing. Anything coming out of England, forget it. That same thing with most Italian stuff because of the pressure there. The best stuff comes from France, which is the least amount of changed information there, and general policy that happened, particularly after the French Revolution, where the church lost a lot of its power. But these are certainly fascinating texts that everybody's interested in. But you've got to mold them into your own personal system. You don't necessarily need to make iron tools. A good ritual magic protective system and formulating the correct circles and squares and all the other things, which is laid out very specifically in the Red Dragon text, is going to be plenty for you to do. If you understand the basics of how a ritual is done and what they're doing there, you can modify that so you can work with it easier. You got to remember, there wasn't any really specific way of doing things. I mean, there were ancient mystery schools, a certain amount of magic schools at different places and different times, certainly in ancient Egypt. But they also were based in a particular god they worshipped and other things. And there'd be one school in one city and another school in another city dedicated to a different god, and they would do things quite different than the other one. So it's difficult to figure out what the true facts are there and how well or not it worked. And ultimately, we don't really know. You got to remember that all these great societies ultimately were conquered by the superior military. Now, there has been major battles and major invasions that have been rebucked and turned back by the use of some sort of prayers or magic. It is interesting, and there is enough cases of these to make it quite interesting. Ultimately, while it may have worked then, most of the time the enemies came back again, and they were generally eventually destroyed. So how powerful all this is and how effective it is always a question. In general, is it any better than somebody's modern magical interpretation that shows you how to do things? Is there something particularly powerful? I mean, you look at Jewish magic, and the Jews have been murdered by the millions since their existence. They lost their societies. They were kicked out. They were conquered. The Romans conquered and destroyed all the Jewish land that was held. It goes on and on and on of cases like that. So if they had the ark, if it was so powerful and all these things, it certainly didn't save their society. So you have to look at this stuff. Even the Egyptians' societies eventually fell. Their magic didn't stop the invasion of the Greek forces. and other forces that attack them, even though obviously they maintained a society for many hundreds of years, or thousands of years even, and were able to achieve some amazing things. We also can look to South America, where they were, I don't know how easily conquered they were, but they were conquered by a relatively small force who, of course, that's a misnomer to a large extent. They got local tribes to fight with them to attack Montezuma, etc. But whatever, tens of thousands or even millions of sacrifices they did in their altars to their gods never has seemed to work for any culture, particularly the South American cultures who even previously, who didn't do human sacrifices when they finally were under pressure, started to, and they ultimately were conquered anyway. So you have to be careful of putting too much credence into a particular old system, because it may or may not have great power in it. What you want to do is try it in your own life and see how it works on a smaller scale. And of course, it is fascinating. We do assume that there is this something intrinsic there if it's lasted this long, but that's another thing, is that just because it has survived doesn't mean it's good. It could actually mean because it's bad, because most of the things that are of great value have never been released to the public. Just like all the ancient treasures have never been found. I mean, they found Tutankhamun's by accident, but most of the treasures have never been found. The treasures of Solomon, the treasures of the Knights Templar, all of these things have been hidden somewhere and never been found. Even the treasures that were taken in World War II from Europe, only a small percentage of those were ever recovered. And, goes on and on with these antiquities that are never found. So just because these have been made it into the public, unfortunately, probably means that they are the lower power of the books. And because if they really were super powerful texts, they would never be allowed for the public to have. And there are encodings in these books for initiates to understand, and they were published for that reason, so that the masses would get a very crude version of the book, but the initiates would be able to look at them and get the secret knowledge out of them. So there's a lot of hidden things in these grimoires, but you as the average person are not going to be able to access that information. And looking back all the time is a real error. You need to start looking ahead. There's so many things coming up. There's new ways of using technologies and brain technologies, of combining those with the ancient, and ways of channeling magical energy through different things. And I'm not talking about just machines, but machine magic, which is something that needs a lot of research. I'm just talking about ways of doing new things in higher states of consciousness and doing magic from that state, or ways of amplifying your brain and spiritual energy so you can have stronger manifestations. We need to start looking ahead. And there's so much old stuff that has never been translated and probably never will be translated, that it is just mind-boggling. But, we need to start looking ahead, following the new future magic, the next level magic, the extreme occultism that's coming. And we need to take all this great old information that's effective and start blending it into this whole new reality, instead of just slavishly looking back. Well, I'm going to, as I mentioned, get this tiger belt because it says that in one of the books. You got to have that on. Well, I think that's childish thinking. We need to get past that kind of childish thinking and move on into the core of what these texts do. But they're very hard to use. They're very scattered unless you have a really fine translation. And we've mentioned the two that really are. Some of the other translations that we offer are much cruder and much harder to use. But, people have to come along and figure out better and more interesting and effective ways of using this technology as well. I mean, this is an endless study. And the people that are being supported are a bunch of hucksters that don't produce any results whatsoever, who take old information, old boring information you can find in any book, and are reproducing that with a bunch of filler. And the new generation coming up is somehow thinking that this is special or profound when it's not, and there's nothing there. There needs to be serious study and research done by a professional class of people. But the masses of people are impressed by stupidity, and they're supporting fools who will produce nothing. I mean, what I've seen lately from these people is really appalling. But if you buy it and you support these people and you follow that, which is the worst part of it, you will fail. Now, anything can be a grimoire in terms of what a grimoire is. And we do need to clarify that a little bit here to come to a close. A grimoire, as we can define it, there's two grimoires. I like to use the term ancient grimoire and grimoire. Grimoire is an instructional booklet. It teaches you a particular magical system. So it's basically a course or an instruction book. So in modern times, there's tons of these things. But generally, it also, to tie it in even in modern times, it means it's been practiced and used by that particular writer of that grimoire, that he has proven it, not just researched and, Wicca was done this way or this ritual was done. And, a lot of the books you have today are just telling you magic systems. There's absolutely no research behind it. So a real grimoire, even a modern one, has been used by that particular occult scientist and has proven that it works. And it's a hardcore instructional booklet. It's not philosophical, and it's not in any way has filler in it. It's pure hardcore how-to information of how to do something. When you get into ancient grimoires, which is what most people think a grimoire is, it's the same information in terms of being a tried and true system the magician has actually proven, and is based in an old system. So the term grimoire is thrown around and bantered around quite a bit, but if you want to define it that way, most people are thinking about as ancient grimoires, and these can be, the term ancient is, because technically the Middle Ages is not ancient, but it all falls into that. Like ancient goes back really to ancient Egypt and those kind of realities. But that's what you're talking about. You're talking about documents that are at least 500 years old or more is an ancient grimoire, and that can come from any particular tradition. There is no particular tradition that these come from. And there's no such thing as a grimoire tradition, which some bozos like to use now. There's no such thing as that. Grimoires are in all different traditions. If you're talking about ancient grimoires, or it would be ancient magical practices, not necessarily. There's no such thing as a grimoire tradition. I'm not sure what that means. What grimoires, from where and what style. There are witchcraft grimoires that go back 500 years or more. So there really is no such thing. That's a very poor terminology that some people now use. Of course, the people that use that don't know anything about occultism. Another red flag to run in the other direction. But ancient grimoires is what everybody's interested in and what everybody thinks. And these are instructional guides, again, that teach you pure how-to information without a bunch of philosophical mumbo-jumbo in there. That's not what a grimoire is about. And again, even in the ancient grimoires, it's a proven system. So you got to keep that in mind so you understand what a grimoire is. And, it comes from different derivations. I'm not even sure all that is important. It tends to come from the French word grammaire. It also is connected to Greek word grimoire or grammar, meant in a pure sense that of the way you pronunciated the actual magical names you were using. And at that particular time, there was a lot of power that was thought of in the actual saying of something. So if you stated something out loud, this was a great way and thought to have a lot of power. And you'd have to say it correctly. But it also talks about grammar. Grammar is not just the way you pronunciate something. It's the combination of information. It's the sentence structure, you could say, in another way. And that sentence structure means how-to information. It's the structure of the ritual, basically. So that's where it comes from. But there's a lot of terms like that. Sorcery is a French term. Basically just means witch. Is a sorcerer, a male witch, a sorceress, a female witch. Sorcery basically just means casting of spells. So, and that's again been distorted to mean of the evoking of demons. It depends where you get all this information from, and these subtleties can be very dangerous to an inexperienced person. What interpretation someone has of something can cause you problems in the future. But everybody loves them. One of the nice things about the Guild's new release of all of our old texts in very cheap ebook editions is you can pretty much have all these classic grimoires and see them and experience them and read them for fun, take out bits and pieces that you like for a very, very low price, and just so you get a feel for all this, which was never available in the past. And people have spent a fortune for a lot of these books, and to collect their own large collection of these and to see a lot of them required a lot of money. That's not the case anymore. So this is a great time to grab all these inexpensive editions that we offer, because we're not sure if we're going to keep those forever. We will be making some sort of new editions, and maybe even having print editions. Everything's up in the air here and takes a huge amount of time and work to achieve. But this is a good time to grab all this stuff while you can still get it at such a low price. Because our books sell literally for thousands and thousands of dollars if you find them. They're not going to get any cheaper, these original editions out there. They're already selling for that. The basic Witchcraft Sorcery course is selling for $10,000. The Red Dragon easily sells for $1,000 or more. So to get that information for pennies, basically, compared to those you can still get now. So they're always good and fun to have, and anybody can play with them to some degree if you have a good foundation. So it's a good time to expand your knowledge base and at least read. And if you're a serious magician, you need to have the Red and Black Dragon and see how original evocation is done. That's how it's done, and that's what all the other books are built on. So that's a very valuable grimoire that's been very carefully translated that everyone should have. So with that, thanks for listening, and let the Guild be your guide.